Hello and welcome to episode 229 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host, Mark the Green Tank, and with me as always are Neelan the Orange Tank.
Hello.
And Kellen the Red Tank.
Hello.
We are here again, your beacons of positivity, and while you come to us for our glowing, unyielding positivity, we have decided to take on positivity and negativity on this show. There's been a lot of talk recently about positive and negative board game reviews in the hobby, and we have decided to examine board game criticism ourselves and talk about if we think the board game world is suffering from too much positivity, too much negativity, the importance of negative reviews, if they're overdone. As the old saying goes, who watches The Watchmen? Well, we're going to be watching The Watchmen and criticizing the critics.
It's sort of like I've been doing this to you two for 228 episodes.
That's correct. That's correct. There's always Papa Kellen watching over us.
Thank you for saying that, Mark.
You got it. You got it. But before we start criticizing the criticizers, we'll be talking about the games we've been playing. Kellen will start us off with Homeworlds. I will follow with Ave Caesar. And finally, Neelan will tell us about the Founders of Teotihuacan. But first, Kellen, tell us about Homeworlds.
Homeworlds is a two-player abstract game that Neelan and I had a chance to play. This was published originally in 2001, but a boxed version was recently released within the last year or two that you can get for less than $20 online, and it's also on Board Game Arena. So no matter what we say about the game, you can try it because it's on Board Game Arena. Homeworlds is a Looney Labs game, so it uses the Looney Labs pyramids, which you may have heard us talk about in the context of Zendo and other games within the Pyramid Arcade. These are translucent, super beautiful pyramids. And Homeworlds is a very strange game. It feels like an abstract strategy game by way of Mr. Carl Chudyk. And when I say the name Mr. Carl Chudyk, you know that I'm excited. I'm really excited, but no one can see how excited I am because the camera is waist up. In Homeworlds, you are building ships and you are attempting to destroy the other player's home world. You can do that in a variety of different ways, but each ship, there are 4 colors and 3 sizes in 1, 2, and 3 pips. Each ship has a different ability attached to it. So the green ship is allowing you to build new ships that look like it, meaning the same color. And what's wild about the game, or one of the things that's wild, is any ship can use the ability of any other ship in that system or the power of the color of the star of that system, meaning that you could use the power of green on a yellow ship in order to duplicate a yellow ship as opposed to a green ship. Make sense? Of course it doesn't. The yellow ships allow you to move, right? The red ships allow you to capture, and capturing works at the same size or higher from a pip value perspective. And the blue ships allow you to trade in one of your ships for another ship. So all of this sounds really straightforward, and it kind of is, but you are also working from a shared pool or bank of ships, meaning that when you build, for example, you build the smallest size available of that color, meaning there's huge tempo considerations. If Neelan is building a small fleet of green ships and suddenly there is a 2 green, I may be incentivized to build that green right then, right there. There's a lot of craziness in this game that's confusing to explain. When you move, you just establish a new star system, but you can only move to star systems that are different sized pip values, meaning if you're on a star that is a 1, you can only move to a 2 or a 3. This makes it really strange and not at all positional as you sort of just establish little territories and then start this sort of tempo game with your opponent. All of that feels very yin-yang, back and forth, 1-to-1, and it would be, except there is one action that you can do called Sacrifice, and that allows you to take any one of your ships of any of the 4 colors and pip value of 1, 2, or 3 and delete it off the board. And if you delete it off the board, you get to use that power up to as many as the pip value anywhere on the board. So you've been analyzing the game state and you're going, Neelan can't capture me over there because he ain't got any red over there. But if Nealon is willing to sacrifice a red ship somewhere else on the map, he actually can use the power of red within that system. And therein lies the fun of Homeworlds, is the amount of different options that are available. There's a lot of ways to lose and win Homeworlds. You have got to take out their multi-level star, which I have not explained and will not explain. You have got to get rid of all of their ships that are at their homeworld, abandoned homeworld. And I think that's actually the only two ways, but there are multiple strategic ways into this. It feels very chess-like in spite of all of those rules I just said. It feels almost thematic, but then there's a lot of unintuitive edges to this. It looks beautiful, and I had a delightful time playing Homeworlds just on the face of a 30-minute game, a lot to think about, emergent ways to play. Nealon, what did you think of our first game of Homeworlds and subsequent? We're playing on BGA right now. It looks a hell of a lot uglier, but it does work.
We ended up playing a few sort of mini games of this back-to-back because one of the things that became very evident in Homeworlds is, like chess, one move can make or break your game, right? So if you make a move that suddenly allows your opposition to capitalize that with the perfect, oh, now I sacrifice this, all my ships in your base, and I've won, that can feel unsatisfying. So we were doing a lot of experimentation, rolling back stuff to explore the game space in our first game. And that is something that if you're prepared to play this as a strict, hey, I've won, let's stop and start over, I can see being frustrating. I feel like games that often will pivot on a single turn can be frustrating, but that's what you're getting into. It's that sort of level of logical abstract. But that said, those turns that allow you to do that feel really powerful. One thing that Kellen actually didn't mention is what I think was one of the most interesting rules in the game, which is overpopulation. So if there are ever 4 components of a given color at a star system, all of them just disappear. You can have only so much yellow in a system, and then they're all gone, which allows you to have like really fun moves, for example, of, hey, Kellen's homeworld is a yellow star. I'm going to move 3 of my yellow ships to Kellen's homeworld. Suddenly all the yellow components disappear and Kellen's homeworld is no more. And those big turn moves, especially when you combine that with the sacrifice action, which is the power move in this. The sacrifice is the game-winning, you set yourself up so that you can sacrifice a ship somewhere, pull off something that your opponent didn't see coming, and you've won the game. And those moments, they feel pretty good. That was at least the best part of my experience playing with it. I do think it is maybe, this is a word I don't love and I don't like using, but it's a little bit too hard to grok for its own good. I kind of found that a lot of our early games of it were just struggling with what we were capable of doing. And I think, like chess or like any very logical abstract, if you were to give it the time of day and say, hey, this is going to be the game that we play with each other for the next little bit, once that complexity barrier dissolves, you're going to have something like really, really special here.
So you guys played this a number of times and are now playing it on BGA. Do you feel like you're at that point where
No.
Okay.
Not even close.
Not even close.
And,
wow.
and the way that we were doing it is basically when one of us, mostly me, would make a critical blunder and then, you know, Nealon would be like, well, I blow up my yellow ship, and we would just roll it back and do other things. So we sort of played a very long game that had multiple ends to it and are now playing again on BGA. But it's like, it goes deep, man. You know, and the rule book is sort of like each homeworld you start with, you actually choose which colors you want on a sort of stacked homeworld. And the rule book is like, oh, do you want to start with the banker, which is starting small, medium, the fortress, which is medium, large, or the Goldilocks, which is small, large. And we haven't even explained why that matters. You know, and the next page is like, don't get bluebirded. You know, like you might say, what the hell does bluebirds have to do with
I know
this
about
game?
getting bluebirded.
Yeah.
Do not get bluebirded.
But it's like that sort of chessy thing.
Yeah.
And there's good and bad to that, right? So this is a game that you can also just concede. Like, I've lost the game. The tempo is gone. And so that sort of razor's edge of it is not normally something that I'm like, yes, I love this. But with this, it's so small. It's so slight. I'm eager to actually even try it with Christina and just see if we might get into a rhythm where we're just having fun. And, you know, it did lead to some fun turns near the end of the game where you've got like 4 star systems set up and figuring out who's adjacent to what and how it all connects. It's a wild little game. And you can get it for like $20 and it's very cute and tiny. Or you can play it on BGA if you want to play the ugly version.
Also, just kind of a really incredible work of design, right? Because there's no board to this. All it is 4 colored pyramids in 3 different sizes, and that's everything you need to play the game. Pretty wild.
And Andrew Looney, the inventor of the pyramids, did not make this game, but it is his favorite game of all time. Again, he made the pyramid, so of course it would be potentially in the running, cough Bandata. But in this case, of all the pyramid games, this is his favorite, and I think that's a pretty good endorsement. There is a 3 or 4 player variant, but I don't know how to play it, and I can't imagine playing it.
You mentioned this was sort of a small and slight, Kellen. I assume that also works out with the game length, although this seems like a game a la chess where if people really want AP, they could probably AP and the game could drag on forever.
Yeah, I think 30 minutes. I think the hard thing is that even when you're losing, you may not be out in terms of, like, it's pretty clear that I was on the defensive for a lot of the game, but Nealon couldn't figure out how to kill me, like the cockroach that I am. Right. But yeah, I mean, I immediately, Mark was just like, oh, I need to play this with Mark because it just strikes me as like one of those you could get really into it and it'll either be, you know, like a secret surprise addition to your top 50 or you'll be too annoyed with it for other reasons. But it's very inviting to me for an abstract to be like ultra colorful, translucent, dumb, and with a theme that, again, is pretty pasted on, but like still does make you feel like you're playing with spaceships.
Yeah, I mean, I had the Pyramid Arcade, which has a bunch of the translucent pyramids and a bunch of games based on those pyramids, and found most of the ones I played to be really lackluster, with some exceptions. I mean, Zendo is a standout for sure, but never got around to Homeworlds. As you were mentioning it, I looked it up on BGG and saw that the weight was like 3.4 or something, 3.3. I was like, wow, what is this? This is strange for a pyramid game. But yeah, you certainly piqued my interest, so interesting.
It's like I can't decide if it's worth spinning it up on BGA for you right now or if, like, maybe I send you a bunch of pretty photos of the board and then you can play on BGA. As long as you promise, Mark, say that you promise that you'll have 2 monitors, one monitor on BGA, one monitor with my photos up.
I mean, I always have a monitor devoted to that, so
thank you for saying
that's
that.
not hard to promise.
And that is Homeworlds by Looney Labs.
I got a chance to break out a game from all the way back in 1989, Ave Caesar by Wolfgang Reideser and published by Asmodee. Right off the bat, I feel like I have to say that I'm not sure how useful this review is going to be, given that it's a 33-year-old game that has been out of print for a little while, but it's still relatively inexpensive on the secondary market, so not all hope is lost if you find this interesting. In Ave Caesar, you are charioteers racing around track 3 times, trying to win the race, while also paying homage to Caesar as you do. The way the racing works is that the track is typically made up of 2 lanes, an inside quicker lane and an outside slower lane. So if you take a turn on the inside of a lane, it might be only like 2 spaces large, while if you take that same turn on the outside lane, it could be like 4 spaces long. And there are also bottlenecks where only one charioteer can pass. The rules of the game are super, super simple. On your turn, you'll look at your hand of 3 cards, which have values printed on them from 1 to 6. You play one of those cards, you move your charioteer that many spaces, and then you draw back up to 3. That's it. Now, there are some slight restrictions as far as how you play your cards, which is what makes the game. The first rule is that you have to be able to move the full amount of your card. So if you play a 5, you must be able to move the entire 5 spaces somehow, even if it means changing lanes. Of course, there might be times, especially at larger player counts,
put on your blinkers.
Right, put on your blinkers is important. But there may be times, especially at larger player counts where Ave Caesar really shines, I think, where you'll have racers, you'll have opponents in front of you, and you won't be able to play the card that you want, and you'll have to play something lower. Or sometimes you won't be able to play any cards in your hand, considering you only have 3 cards in your hand total, and at that point you just lose your turn. You simply are skipped. The other rule is that you can never play a 6, which is, again, the highest movement card, if you're in the lead or tied for the lead. So jumping out ahead can be a dangerous proposal.
That's thematic.
That is thematic. That's how the charioteers moved.
No drafting allowed in this game.
That's right. That's right. Finally, your deck of cards, which is specific to each player, never is replenished. So much like Flamme Rouge, if you're unable to finish the race with your deck because you've taken too many outside tracks or otherwise burn your card somehow, you just won't be able to finish. Though this is a rare thing, so not something you have to really worry about. Oh, and you might be remembering me saying that in addition to winning the race, you also need to pay homage to Caesar.
We did.
I'm sure our listeners who hang on my every word do remember that, Kellen, despite your protestations. Well, this comes in the form of one of the weirdest components in board games, in my opinion. So in addition to your charioteer and your deck of cards, each player gets a coin in their color. And once during the first 2 laps of the 3-lap race, you have to take the outside lane near the sort of starting line, which is a narrow lane in front of Caesar's box. And you have to make sure to stop in that lane in front of Caesar, and then you toss your coin on the board and say, Ave Caesar. So it's a coin that is only there to be thrown by the players in this one weird ceremonial aspect of the game. It's also, in addition to being almost completely superfluous, it's also super silly fun, which is true of the game of Ave Caesar as a whole. It's an extremely light, silly party game that I've introduced to non-gaming friends and family with a lot of success. The blocking aspect makes it a little off-kilter, a little surprising for folks who aren't used to modern board games and who are expecting a game like this, a racing game like this, to be something more along the lines of Candyland or Chutes and Ladders. So it's a little bit of meanness that has people laughing around the table when they can't use any of their cards. And yeah, that means that their turn is skipped, but the game moves so fast that it's really not a big deal. It's sort of like Ethnos in that way, where the turns just whip around, whip around, whip around. So Ave Caesar isn't going to blow any gamers' socks off, but if you're looking for a fun, frantic race game that you'll definitely be able to teach friends and family, I would recommend Ave Caesar. It's a game that I've had in my collection for a little while that I can't imagine ever getting rid of, just because it's so accessible and the racing element is such a clear, fun victory condition.
Mark, you've lost Kellen with 1989 and Rome. Hold on, I'm going to get him back. I'm getting him back.
All right.
Kellen, click the picture. Click the picture.
What? This is a podcast.
Is this the Dice Tree version? The Korean Dice Tree version?
Japanese Mobius version, apparently.
Oh, okay.
No, isn't this Winner's Circle? Oh, no. This is QJet 21XX.
QJet
Yeah.
21XX, baby. The Japanese version of Ave Caesar with space bikes.
Callan may not like 18XX games, but he sure as hell likes Japanese 21XX games.
I'm so lost. I get it now.
And that actually looks like a terrible redesign.
I'm weirdly into it.
Are you really? It looks
Yeah,
so like
kind
garish to me.
Yeah, it is. But okay, look, the original's not exactly coming up on last week's episode.
That's true. That's fair. That's fair. Anyhow, that is Ave Caesar by Wolfgang Redisser and Asmodee.
So, I have been playing Founders of Teotihuacan. This is designed by Philippe Glowacz. This was a review copy sent to us by Board and Dice. The first thing you might be wondering is, how is this connected to Teotihuacan?
Or Founders of Gloomhaven.
Or Founders of Gloomhaven. Actually, funny enough, more on that later. But as far as Teotihuacan goes, barely at all. It doesn't have the same designer. It is by the same publisher. It is obviously designed to fit in that franchise.
It has the same cultural appropriation.
Exactly. Equally problematic, but largely completely different from Teotihuacan. The only shared mechanic is this idea of building the pyramid in the center of your board. But what Founders of Teotihuacan is a largely multiplayer solitaire polyomino game. Now, I like polyomino games a lot, so I was super intrigued to try this. Let's start by breaking down the basic systems of this game. This is largely a worker placement game. On your turn, there are a bunch of actions available to you that are divided into 3 main sections. You're going to place one or more discs onto one of those actions in order to determine the strength at which you do that action. But here's probably the coolest part about this system. If I take a action, someone else is allowed to take that action on top of me, and then they add my strength to their strength. So by taking an action, I'm making it stronger for other people. Up to a limit. There's a cap on how many discs can be on a specific action. Those actions amount to getting polyomino tiles, which is restricted by what your strength is. And those are divided into 2 main types. Ones which produce resources. So as soon as you put one of those onto your board, you then take resource cubes. You place them of the same color all around that piece you just placed. So imagine you just place like this 1x1 brown wood producing building. And then at all 4 of the edges, you put a little brown cube. Those resources are now available to use on the buildings that require them, like the second type, the temples. The temples are primarily how you're going to be scoring points in the game. They cost the resources that you've produced using your production buildings, and they will multiply with the placement of specifically corresponding colored temple pieces in the middle of your board. So, let's say, for example, in the top left corner of my board at the end of the game, I have 2 of these temples, and I also happen to have a green pyramid piece in the middle of my board that's in that same quadrant. I am now getting 2 points for that pyramid piece. If I have 2 pyramid pieces that connect to that quadrant, I'm getting 2 times 2, 4 points. You can easily imagine how you will start getting these very high scoring potentials in the game. There are points that you get throughout the game, but the large majority of most people's points, I think, are going to be coming from that end of game scoring. Now, if all of that sounds fairly simple, here's where this gets really, really brain-burny. On every turn you take of the game, you're going to have a little architect figure that starts at the top edge of the board and slowly rotates around your board. And you're only allowed to place pieces into the half of the board where your architect is. So there is a very specific timing to when you're allowed to place pieces onto your board. And as you can imagine, that matching up with the timing of when you want to take specific actions, that's what the puzzle is. On top of that, if you ever place a piece on top of one of the resources, remember your resources are going onto the board, that resource disappears. So you kind of want to place resources in a way that they're not going to get stumped by other pieces, and the board's not as open as you imagine it's going to be. So it ends up feeling really, really restrictive to a fault, in my opinion. I think that the amount of thought that had to go into even relatively simple actions, and I want to be clear, like this might be someone's jam, but I wasn't loving the investment of thought it took to figure out, okay, I want to put this 1-by-1 piece on my board. Where are the best places I can put this so that the resources aren't likely to get overlapped by other buildings down the line? The worst part about this is this aforementioned architect thing, right? Like as you're getting towards the end of the game, you start to have to really think, oh, am I even going to get to place a piece? Is the architect going to move around enough to be able to get to the position where I'm able to place a piece that I critically need it? Because your actual number of actions in a game of Founders of Teotihuacan is fairly low. There is so much forward planning that you have to do, to the extent that I found in all of my games of it, I was making critical blunders on early turns that I would live to regret later down the line, which I don't mind. That is something I associate with a lot of Splotter games I really love, for example. But in a game that should feel lighter, or at least to me felt like it should have been lighter, really bummed me out in Founders of Teotihuacan. I think the biggest problem that this game has is going to be one of expectation. I don't think I'm wrong to say that this is the heaviest polyomino game in terms of complexity. It's not on the weight class of A Feast for Odin, but A Feast for Odin I don't consider as being an especially complex game, just a big game. There's a lot to explain in The Feast for Odin, but the actual mechanics are fairly simple. Every action I was taking in Founders of Teotihuacan felt like it was hurting me in a way that didn't feel great. It reminds me, Mark, a little bit of what we were talking about with Calico, for example. But now imagine Calico in a form that takes, 3 times longer to play, and you feel just as punished for point choices that you were making early on. I really wanted to like this. Enough so that after my first impression of it, I kept going back to it, trying to figure out like what I was missing. If subsequent plays was going to like lead to some sort of like revelation that was going to turn it around for me. I don't think I ever got there, unfortunately. I think it's just a little bit too fiddly for its own good. And then the mechanics of what you're doing aren't that complex, but the way that everything like interconnects is both very admirable, but also just a lot. Like anytime you place a building, in order to do anything, it's like, okay, I'm going to place this resource building, which I know is what I'm going to need to place this, but every single one of those choices is important. None of them is trivial. And that's not bad. Like, I think some people might look at them and be like, that's great. I want every single choice in my game to matter. But the extent to which every single choice in your game matters in this, I found not what I want out of a polyomino game.
So I have 3 questions.
Yeah.
Neelan. First, you mentioned obviously that one of your gripes is there's a relatively few number of turns and you can make a mistake early, it can really mess you up. Is there an opportunity or a mechanism there to mitigate that? Is there, like, for example, a way to move the architect around faster?
No.
Okay.
And that's kind of it, right? I had the same thought as you, Mark. It's like, hey, maybe there's like a once a game, oh, I'm just going to need to move my architect but forward once or back. There's nothing really like that. You really have to be super on with what you're planning to doing, almost start to finish in this game in order to get the most out of it.
Okay. That's sort of surprising. I thought there'd be something where you could sacrifice like a worker, you could take an action there to do it. But the second thing is you mentioned, Calico, but in a much longer time frame. The box says, or at least BGG says, that they're claiming a 45 to 60 minute game. You find that to be way undersold.
No, I think about an hour. I think an hour is about the right length. I think that's that's close to where we ended up on it. But I don't think that that's typical for this weight of polyomino game.
Right.
Like when I think about the stuff that like works for me the best in this realm, stuff like the Uwe trilogy, Baron Park, stuff like that, they're all half an hour-ish games, right? And this is also a game where for the full extent of that hour, you're going to be pulling your hair out, clutching at your temples, staring down at your board.
And sort of speaking of that weight and the expectations, you mentioned people who are maybe going into this expecting something lighter from a polyomino game. What about folks who are partially at least interested in this because of the Teotihuacan reference? Because Teotihuacan is a medium heavy game. It sounds to me that there might be people who are, buying this, because I didn't really know much about this game aside from the name. And what came to me is, oh, this is going to be a heavy game. Again, knowing nothing about it besides the association with the name. I guess maybe there's an audience that will like it because of the heaviness.
Potentially. I know full well that everything I'm saying now, in the same way that, I don't think that we're in the majority opinion on something like Calico, for example. I know that a lot of people would be listening to this being like, oh, that sounds great to me. I want a game that's going to be really intense and, head down, brains burny. But yeah, I don't think that this is going to be a one-to-one for people that are that are fans of Teotihuacan, for example, because it doesn't play anything like Teotihuacan. Like, to be complete, the only similarity is you're kind of building a pyramid in the middle, and this looks graphically like Teotihuacan. No other real shared mechanics whatsoever. I think that they have an upward struggle about finding an audience for this, in my opinion, but... It certainly reminds me a little bit of like the heavy roll and write subgenre, right? There is an audience for this, but I think I increasingly find that if I want a heavier game, that is not the genre I would go to.
Yeah, I get it.
You're saying that it's not for you, but that there's no such thing as a good or bad review.
Exactly.
It could be for someone.
Absolutely.
If that someone likes bad games.
Almost there.
Yeah, you're with me right until the end there.
I had you going.
I mentioned briefly earlier that there was a Founders of Gloomhaven section. I promise you that's not just the name. For whatever reason, I couldn't help but think about Founders of Gloomhaven, which is a game that I admire a lot more than I like playing. There is something about the way this is designed, how every single piece is connected to every other piece, that is quite clever if you're willing to go down that road. But I think this needed more design polish. There are aspects of the design, some placements on the board that I don't think ought to be there, that feel a little bit undercooked. It just feels like it's a couple of twists away from being a game that I could like, but as it is, not for me. That is Founders of Teotihuacan.
Before we move on, a big happy birthday to one of our favorite people in the board game universe, Casey, a.k.a. Brain in a Jar. You can find her on TikTok and Twitch, among other places. I mentioned TikTok, I should just say as a quick aside, and this is 100% true. My girlfriend, who is a non-gamer, quote unquote, follows Casey on TikTok and has come up to me and said she makes games look fun, and has told me that, Casey makes her want to play all these games, despite the fact that I try to make her play all these games and try to warmly invite her into the board game world. But no, Casey has stepped ahead and done that instead of me. So a big happy birthday to Casey from all of us.
One of the kindest people I know, taught me the expansion for Anachrony at Dice Tower West. Got a chance to hang out a lot there. Happy birthday, Casey.
I believe she beat me at Bear Raid, so I don't know if I want to wish her a happy birthday. No, someone we genuinely admire within the space, and I've been discussing when to have her on the show, so we should have had her on the birthday episode. Too bad, she's in Vancouver. Enjoy it.
before we move on to reviewing the reviewers, why don't you review these reviewers by reviewing us on our favorite repository for reviews, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you found us.
Spotify, Google Podcasts. It does help a lot. I know there's a little joke in there, but reviews for the podcast are the number one way that you can help support the podcast, besides giving us actual money on patreon.com/boardgamebarrage.
Which you're, yes, absolutely also welcome to do. Also, on a very self-centered aspect, I also love seeing those reviews. Whenever we get a 5-star review, it's one of the quickest way that my day gets brightened up by seeing that and reading the comments people leave. They are often hilarious, but they're always great. So leave us a review. All right, let's move on to the main topic. Board game criticism. Positive reviews, negative reviews. Is there a place for one? Is there too much of the other? So let's just start off by saying that I think most people who listen to the show know that we are pro-negative reviews when we believe they're warranted. I think that's a fair statement.
I want to argue with you, but I think I agree.
Okay. Do you actually want to argue with me?
So there's a lot in that sentence that we have to unpack, because on the face of it, I can't get behind it. One, because the phrase negative reviews doesn't make sense, first of all, and that like we would be pro or con that, or when it's warranted. It's sort of like, again, and we've debated this for many times, right? All experience is subjective, all of it. Every single thing that you think you like, it's subjective. And so it's not when it warrants it, it's when our experience is negative, we will tell you that it's negative, ergo, that's why we have a podcast. So your sentence, in general, we're pro-negative reviews. On the face of it, I'm not sure I can agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's...
You're trying to get us to sort of talk through it, because not everyone in the board game world feels that same way.
Right. It may have been a clunky way to say it, but I think the sentiment comes across.
Yeah, so it's like the very common way as a scapegoat that I often feel when, and you know, we are probably not going to name any specific names, but within the board game industry, it's sort of like, if you like really long board games that aren't as complicated as they should be, then maybe you should play Monopoly. Kind of like there's an audience for every game. It's sort of this idea that the de facto standard is that all of these games are good, and then they will attempt to sort of, through the review, just sort of say, if you are this weird, specific niche person, you might like the game. And so it's almost in how you articulate it, because we often will not do that thing. But even Neelan, in his little conversation on Founders of Teotihuacan, sort of started doing that near the end, which is like, look, for some people, I'm sure they might like this, but I did not.
Yeah, I think that's the weird needle you're threading when you're doing this, right? Because I think that the kind of cliche is referring to a thing as bad without qualifying that means I didn't like it. And look, that's our job. We're critics. If we're saying something's bad, the subtext should be, no, this is not going to be bad for everyone, but we didn't like it. And I've kind of long held to the idea that one of the most valuable ways that I appreciate criticism is, hey, you listen to someone, you learn what their tastes are over the long haul, and then whether a review is like negative or positive, you can take from their perspective and how you've related to their perspective in the past, whether that thing is going to be for you. Like, I don't think anyone's relationship to a critic should be, oh, I'm only going to play the games that Neelan thinks are good. My absolute hope is that someone comes away from a negative review and is like, hey, I heard what you were saying, and I think that this could be for me. Then I've done my job.
I, in general, agree with what you're saying, Callan, about the sort of inanity of saying, but if you like this, then you might like it. I get that, and I agree with it sort of in spirit. The thing that I would sort of push back on a little bit is that in my life, when it comes to critics that I like or critics that I listen to, be it any sort of form of media, be it book critics or movie critics or whatever, I have critics that I sort of align myself with, right? And I do find it, and maybe this is a personal failing of mine, jarring when a critic that I enjoy trash talks a game or a movie or a book that I enjoy unreservedly. It's jarring, and it's not a pleasant feeling for me, and I don't know, there could be an argument that says, like, well, even if it's not pleasant, maybe it's instructive or important, but There is something to me, in my experience with listening or reading criticism, where something that I enjoy by a critic that I usually agree with or usually listen to or usually appreciate, when they do say something along the lines of like, hey, there is this aspect of the book or movie that is positive or is worthy of spotlight or is a positive aspect of it. And just seeing that sort of like tempering of criticism, I think, even if like part of me wants to say, no, I want everything like black and white, or I want it served to me like no holds barred, just tell me how you feel. In fact, when it actually happens to me, I do like to see some level of tempering in those cases where a critic zigs where I zag, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, right? One is the word critic, which I don't know that I would agree that we're critics, or that there is very much board game criticism, but that's a sidebar that we can put a pin in. You know, it's sort of like the reviews of a movie that's like, this movie was so terrible and I hated every part of it, but it was 7 hours long and it made me feel like I was also, too, in the horrors of the Vietnam War. You know, it's like, what? Or a board game review where it's like, well, it's a lovely production, but everything else is If that's tempering, I don't know.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, like tempering for the sake of tempering, maybe not, but I've seen when it comes to like movies, like the movie was terrible, whatever, but this performance was great. Or a game is terrible, but there's this interesting mechanic. Or if you're a fan of auction mechanics, you'll like this because it's an interesting take. And so maybe this is not what you're advocating against, and maybe we're talking about two different things, but I think there's something to but if you like X, you might like it. I mean, again, if you do it all the time, then it sort of waters down, in my opinion, your critical bona fides, but I think there is something about it.
I think that it's more specific to board games, which is that, again, I'm making up numbers.
Sure.
80 to 90% of the board game reviews are overwhelmingly positive. And then the 20% that are not are tempered to
right.
They're just like, it's all temper, if we want to call it that. And so it's sort of like, the zeitgeist or the conversation that's happening right now is around the value and purpose of reviews that are just negative, right? And there's like a whole host of reasons why there aren't as many quote-unquote negative board game reviews. I think we could go through laundry lists of them and talk about them ad nauseum, but it's like people only play games that they're interested in. People only want to talk about games that they're interested in. People want to play games multiple times, which isn't going to happen if it's a game they dislike. Most published games are good because they're being vetted by publishers. The board game industry is very small, so the review copies are being handed out by publishers to board game critics, quote-unquote, who are then being nicer than they should be, perhaps. The board game industry is ultra small, where it's like there are publishers who are also reviewers. Everyone is friends with everyone when you go to these conventions, and it's very hard to be friends with a designer and then go on air and say that you really dislike their product.
It's interesting because while I do agree with you that the vast majority of board game criticism is quote-unquote too positive, I do think that the critics that have sort of risen in the industry are the ones that are not afraid to talk about both sides, to be negative. I'm not thinking of any critic right now, but I feel like, and I've experienced this when I first got into the hobby, I did see a lot of positive, and then at first I was swept up in the hobby and everything did feel great to me, but then after playing games for a while, I'd go to that same reviewer and get another positive review and then get that game and then realize this isn't that great, and then I just stopped sort of going to that critic. And I think that the ones that have been quote-unquote rewarded in the hobby are the ones that have risen to prominence. Shut Up and Sit Down, So Very Wrong About Games, even the Dice Tower, who are generally positive, but Tom will not pull a punch if he doesn't like something about a game. I think the ones that have risen to prominence are the ones that aren't afraid to talk about the negative aspects of games.
So there are a couple things, and one of the main rules of our Discord is that you're not allowed to talk about other content creators. And so that's hypocritical to some degree, which is like, I personally don't really like talking about board game critics because it's mean and I come across mean things that are written about me in other places, and so ergo it's a rule on our Discord. So that's a little bit, you could make the argument that's hypocritical as it relates to board game reviews. I think that there's a lot of privilege. And again, when I'm using the word, I'm being serious. Like the people who are beholden, shut up and sit down, and the Dice Tower get every board game sent to them no matter what they say because it is positive for the game itself. Just being mentioned in one of those outlets will cause it to rise on Board Game Geek in terms of the hotness. So it's like they can afford quite literally to be more negative than those who are more beholden to the publishers to give them review copies of games. And even going further, right, it's like the reviewers that we have are the people with an abundance of free time, an abundance of money, and or they're getting their review copies from publishers by way of mostly positive coverage.
Well, so that's true of critics in any form of media are going to be getting advanced copies or getting chance to see screeners or getting whatever. And to not be too self-congratulatory, I mean, look at us. I mean, we get review copies. We don't get a ton of review copies necessarily. And we're not like doing anything crazy out of the ordinary. We're doing a podcast, and yet we just won the Golden Geek. There's some sort of recognition that we're doing something right. And I think a big part of that is the fact that we're willing to talk about games that fail and the games that succeed. I think that is sort of like...
Trust.
You're right.
We're trusted.
Right.
It's not about being honest. It's not about being positive or negative. Well, it is about being honest. It's about being trusted by the people who are listening to it.
And I think trust is the key word, right? I think it's the thing that, to reiterate what I was saying, like I think that the value of someone whose opinion you listen to or someone whose opinion that you return to is that you've established trust with that person. And I don't think you have to be more negative than positive or some balance of positive and negative to achieve trust, but you just need to be authentic, right? Like I firmly believe that you could be a critic that only speaks positively about your experience as long as you are speaking authentically about those experiences. And like the reason that you don't cover negative games could be for any of the reasons that Kellen mentioned earlier, right? It's quite frankly, even if you just go by the maxim that you should enjoy what you're doing, I find it more fun to talk about stuff that I'm excited about. A large part of what I enjoy about doing this record is sharing my opinion with other people so that other people can experience the same joy I found in the things that I like, right? That comes across more when I do a positive review of something. Honest to God, if I do a negative review of something, I'm spent most of the rest of the week thinking like, oh my God, someone's going to disagree with this negative review and I'm just not going to hear the end of it. Like case in point, the Azul Queen's Garden, when we spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. There were a lot of people that reached out to say that I was mischaracterizing Azul or that my perspective of it was straight up incorrect. And that's fine. That's what it is. They may be right. But I think that the people that have been listening to this podcast for X length of time know that that was my authentic reaction to playing Azul's Queen's Garden. It wasn't just a rant for the sake of ranting. It was a earned opinion that may differ from what theirs is.
So, okay. So the only sentence, and it was a little while back, I don't agree that someone could decide to only share positive experiences that they had within the hobby and maintain some status as reviewer/critic. I would say, and some of this comes from like approach, and we can talk about that perhaps for a minute. It's like my personal approach all the time, always, or as close to always as I can be, is should someone spend money on this? I have like a huge bias against big corporations, a huge bias towards saving money. You know, these are like real, like actual things. You know, I remember what it feels like to not have a lot of money. You know, relatively speaking, of course, there are always people who've had it better or worse than me. And so I find that someone who says, I'm a board game reviewer or whatever, I make board game YouTube videos, I make board game podcasts, and they play 10 new games a week, and then their podcast is about the 2 good ones, I would say that they are failing me as a barometer. I don't know. And again, I guess that's my bias. And if they are clear about what they're doing, then they can, of course, do that. And they don't have to appeal to me. But it's like, to me, I feel like I'm lying by omission by not sharing the experience with games that I dislike, that are new, that people may go out and buy. Because often what we get is, 10 emails, 10 Discord messages. What do you guys think about this new game? What do you guys think about this new game? the world where we've played that new game and really, 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 really hate it, but don't ever talk about it feels like wrong to me.
Sure. I think I agree with that. I think that we're generally good about, even if our hot take on a new game was negative, we will talk about that, right? But I do think the flip side, which is something you acknowledged earlier, right? There are any number of small games that are not in the hotness that we play, that we don't react strongly to, and just like, okay, that's not even going to be worth talking about. No one is going to come away from that review changed because it was a game that either hadn't entered their purview and might only enter their purview if we were to talk about it.
To your point, Kellen, about the reviewers who will play 10 games and only talk about the 2 that they enjoy, I can think of a number of reviewers that do that. And part of me thinks that they are highlighting games that people who agree with their taste or feel like their tastes align with the reviewer's taste know that these are negative by omission. They're basically saying, like, if I don't review a game, it's a game that is not up my alley, that I don't like, or it's just not a game for me. So is there something to be said for reviewers who like have a taste that their listeners or viewers align with, and just know that if this person reviews a game, that there's an implicit, this is at least a good game, if you like games that I like, and there's that sort of like shadow negativity, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think that that's fair if everyone knows that that's what's happening. I think that there's a lot, and I think that we're being very kind and to some degree just a smidgen cagey, because it's like a lot of it is just marketing. Like the reviews are marketing, they are not reviews. So like we're saying the nice things, but like we've had many publishers remove us from their review list after negative coverage of their games. We've had publishers ask us not to publish things. We've had publishers tell us, that we must be idiots for not being able to understand their game, when I was trying to be nice and say, I don't like your game. I don't think I get it. Maybe we should send it to someone else. And, their reply was like, my 12-year-old gets this game. Like literally, full stop.
Yeah.
So, and then when you compound that with the fact that all of these people are friends with all of these people, and many people who start in board game journalism, board game criticism, board game reviewing, end up working for the publishers, it's very small. It's very, very, very small. And I do think that is sort of not generally understood. That's the one thing I would say. But yeah, I would never want to police someone and say, like, you have to cover the bad game. Like if it's pretty clear what you're doing, again, honesty and trust, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But again, it's also like, it's like the thing where they say that politicians should have to wear like NASCAR jerseys or whatever with all the people who've donated money to them. I think that it'd be surprising to see all of the connections that board game press have with the board game publishers themselves. And, I'm not trying to throw mud at anyone in specifically. I don't even literally have anyone in mind. But we actively, as a podcast, don't bring designers onto the show. And again, we might do that in the future. I can't say we will never do that, but that's a conscious effort to not allow us to be confused by like our emotional relationships with people. I mean, I wouldn't know how else to do it, because I've become friends with some of these publishers, even only seeing them at conventions.
No, yeah, I totally agree. Just my whole, to sort of put my own button on this, I definitely groan when I see people who are, I think, review games just completely positively. But my belief is that just, again, people are going to be interested in them, at least, especially early in their lifetime in the hobby. But I just think that eventually people are going to work themselves away from those kind of like rubber stamp positive things and to move on to people who are more critical. I just think that's my like deep held belief. I also will say that I have noticed some people who are on the other side of the spectrum when it comes to reviewing games, who are just almost exclusively negative. And I find that just as, if not honestly, like worse, where it's just like, okay, they're reviewing a new game, they're definitely going to be contrarian. I mean, that's not to say that, new games are above, obviously, like older games or whatever, but there are reviewers out there who I know if I watch a video or listen to the show, they're going to be almost unfailingly negative. And it's just like, you feel like you're bashing your head against the wall listening to that, because it's just like, okay, what will give you joy? Like, is there anything out there that is fun? Are board games at all fun?
No.
For you?
No, but so my counter argument, my fight with you, and I will name names here because they are good, close friends of ours. I would say that I am often lumped into that category of never likes anything, and so is, I would say, the most common criticism of So Very Wrong About Games is that they are in fact too negative, which I find preposterous, like full stop. I think they're the best in the business, or very close to it. I mean, we did just win, so we've won an award more recently than them. But how do you factor that in, right? Like, what is are you trying to say there's some ratio of positivity to negativity, and
no.
swag works for you, or how does it?
So to be 100% clear, I'm not talking about So Very Wrong About Games. I'm certainly going to talk about you, because I think in both cases, there are games that both you and Mark and Mike have talked about in glowing, very excited terms that have been games that I would never have played otherwise, that when I hear, especially you guys talk about it, because you're not afraid to talk about games in negative light, I'm even more excited to play. But I have seen, I think, a growth in this sort of like spurt of reviewers who are 99% negative. And it just is so tiresome to me to be on that side. Like, certainly being positive, rubber stamping is tiresome and loathsome and something I'm not interested at all in. But the other side is just as bad, if not worse, in my opinion. And of course, I don't think you're arguing for that, or anybody here is arguing for that. But just being too cool for school and saying everything sucks is also really annoying.
But I think to be like the most general about that position, right, which I think you would agree with, right, is that I would never expect X person to have this percentage of positive reviews and this percentage of negative reviews either. There is no correct answer to that. I would just as easily trust and respect the opinion of someone that was negative most of the time as someone that was positive most of the time. Like, that's not a factor.
Sure.
How often you are positive or negative does not affect my willingness to take you seriously. It's how you talk about those games, how you talk about your positive experiences, how they inform your negative experiences, and vice versa. Like, it's all part of that, hey, do I actually believe the things that you are telling me? And does that align with a picture of you that I can start to form in my head as you talk about other games?
And I do think that there is a hand-waving conflation of honest and negative.
Absolutely.
And that's sort of where that comes from, I think. And I do hope, more than anything, that no one takes away any of my mini rants in this to say that that's better than anything else, because that is annoying as hell and wrong. But again, we do have entire board game communities on the internet where you're only allowed to say positive things, which I also think is wrong. And so it's like, even in the rules of how we moderate our Discord, which is thousands of people talking about board games and probably hundreds to thousands of people that don't even listen to the podcast anymore. It's like, it's a community, a nice community. We want to promote positive interactions with people, and yet there's a lot of trash talking of individual games. And so I do think the voice that we don't have here is the publisher, and there are a lot of small-time publishers, and again, most of them are small-time publishers. And so what argument do you have to them that say, hey, that's a real person who spent 6 months to 3 years to make this game and put it on Kickstarter? Like, you can't be so flippant after playing it twice. What do you say to that person? I'm the publisher now.
I say that I actually 100% agree with that. I think it is important because, I mean, look, I'm going to be completely frank. Like, there are times I play a game.
Completely honest.
Yeah, for the first time ever on this podcast, I'm going to be completely honest. There are times where I play a game and I don't like it. I think it's terrible. And part of me, again, totally frank, is excited to get on the show and just rip it. You know, I mean, to be honest, it's not a great side of my personality or character, but there's times where I feel that way. I think most of the time I will hold back, or I will, like, to use our buzzword here, temper myself before I actually get on the show. But there have been times for sure where I've reviewed a game negatively, and then I hear from the publisher, or I hear from the designer, even worse, even more impactful, I should say. And that is a good wake-up call for me. I think that's important. One thing that I pride myself on, and I think I feel pride about the show on, is I think that whenever we bring up a negative point, we say that, again, as Kellen has said, as Neil has said, we say that out of honesty, and we can defend our position. I think that's the most important thing. Like, I've never said something negative about a game where I didn't feel like I could 100% defend my position. But it's also important to know that there are people who have spent a lot of time on these things, and while you should still criticize their product, the games that they've made and stuff like that, there's no need to like take shots, take like flippant shots. You know, every once in a while it's funny and whatever, but whenever I read a response from a designer or something, I like it because I know I can defend myself. I can say, hey, this is what I didn't like or whatever, but it's also important, I think, to know that these are not just factories all the time, just producing games, faceless entities, that there are people behind this. And it's good to have a humanity when you're going to talk about the negative aspects of a game.
It's funny. I used to think like that, and now I'm not sure anymore. I think that, like, and again, without naming specific games, the games are a product. I used to think that a designer had their idea for their game Risk, and they spent like 10 years coming up with Risk and like perfecting it. But now we have a lot of board games as a product, which is like, how are we going to come out with a new version of that game every year? And the construction of it is much more cynical. And maybe it's always been like that, and I just wasn't aware of that, so I'm not saying this is the new trend. But like you're saying, hey, man, there's an artist, not you, and I know I brought it up first. The argument is like, hey, I know there's an artist on the other end of this, and I don't know that that's always the case. Obviously, there's an artist. Obviously, there's someone who has spent a lot of equity getting to it. But I find a lot of the output that is coming out right now to be pretty cynical and not worthy of that level of sort of like tempering.
It's also sometimes more nebulous, right? Because I can't help but think about a game like Quest, which came out recently, which has a designer's note in the box that is almost certainly like, hey, this is not the game as the rules were written, but here's how I would prefer to play it instead, because that's had like developer or publisher quote-unquote interference along the way, right? So, like, I don't think you're necessarily striking at the heart of a designer always by criticizing a game. Like, I think it is ultimately a product that's had multiple people's input into it. It's had testing one way or another. Some of the end product might be something that the designer doesn't wholeheartedly agree with. I think that ultimately you're only better served by reviewing the thing that will be in people's hands at the end of the day. You're reviewing the boxed product of the board game, and I think it's always interesting to have your review be informed by the way a specific designer thinks, but I think ultimately there has to be some degree of separation between the two. I think that idea though, Mark, of like being wary of what the other person, how they will react, this was kind of prevalent even in the lead up to my Founders of Teotihuacan review. This was a review copy that was sent to us like a few months ago, and due to circumstances, mostly me being out of the country, I wasn't able to talk about it. And I got a follow-up review saying like, hey, did you ever cover this? And I had to be like, no, I haven't been able to. So it led to this, oh, I have to play this. I need to talk about this. I played it the first time, and my reaction wasn't strong. But in the back of my head, I'm thinking like, oh, they're eagerly waiting for this review, so I maybe owe it more. And I had the suspicion that I could turn around if I played it more. I played it more. That didn't happen. At every point of the process, I wanted to get to the point where it was a game that I understood and enjoyed and liked, rather than just saying, hey, we played it once, I don't particularly want to talk about it. But ultimately, I was confident in my opinion of it, having played it multiple times, to the extent that's like, yeah, no, this is not just me being obligated to like not talk about it or talk about a game on a seat of my pants like reaction. I felt pretty strongly after multiple plays of it that I did have something to say about it that was negative and worth putting out there. And like that internal like dialogue and that feedback and reacting to like what someone else is saying to you in terms of external pressure, I do think that that is important. And I think the thing I want to convey is that like that's all part of what's going through our heads when we're talking about any game. It all is at the sum total of expectation and experience, and hey, we feel confident to put this opinion out there.
Sure, but I think it's important to think about the people who are involved, because as we said, like, board gaming is not a huge hobby. It's not, nobody's like necessarily, or very few are getting like rich at the hobby. So there are a lot of people who are doing this not for the love, but they're scraping by, they're hustling by. And so yes, you review the finished product, and that's important. But I think, you know, a big movie comes out that is a flop. It's a little easier to ridicule or make fun. There's a ton of like bad movie podcasts and whatever, because these are behemoths that are made by studios that are going to make $100 million even on a bad movie. And so, yeah, take a pot shot because everybody's getting rich anyway. So it's not that impactful. Of course, this is like a gray area. I'm not saying this is like a black and white thing, but like, when it comes to a board game, yes, if a game is terrible, say why it's terrible. But I just don't think there's really any reason to lash out willy-nilly without some consideration of the people behind it. Like, it's fun to take shots. It is fun to take shots, and as I said earlier, but like, I just think it's important to realize that the line between where you are and where they are is fairly small. And yes, if their output is like cynical and it's pretty clear, even call that out. But it's like a thing where, you write a tweet out, you have this like fiery opinion, and you write the tweet out and you just read it before you send it. Is this a good thing? Is what I'm sending out there something that is good? Maybe I shouldn't think I'm like really funny and witty by saying this thing that's just incendiary or mean or whatever. And yes, call it out. I 100% agree, but it's just like, just consider. I think consideration is not a bad thing. I don't think that's a groundbreaking.
No, and to be clear, I don't disagree with you on that. I think almost all aspects of the way that we interact as humans is vastly improved by remembering that people are responsible for everything we interact with ultimately, like, and especially in the context of a small industry. I just do think that there is a dark road where you are fearful to say anything,
sure,
for fear of backlash.
And I mostly agree, Mark, but where I don't agree is like you're saying, don't just punch someone in the face, right? Like, don't just take the shot. And I would say that publishing a poor game and marketing it to people, they have already punched at you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just think, like, okay, like maybe like take the punch, but don't stomp them when they're down. I mean, but even that is not really what I'm trying to say here. I just think,
I
just consider, just
for sure.
Again, yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think that's something that we tune over time, and I think we're probably near the end of this, but it's like how we talk to each other is different. And actually, that's one of the weirdest things about talking to people who listen to the podcast is that they assume that we will immediately begin communicating exactly like we do now, but that isn't the case. It's because like we have supreme trust in each other that we can sort of spitball and kind of push each other in different directions, that like you're listening to a conversation right now among very, very close friends, and that changes even the tenor or how we sometimes discuss things, or always how we discuss things.
So that is going to do it for our episode. Go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord and go to the podcast channel where we discuss the current week's episode and tell us what you think about the state of board game criticism and what we have to say, maybe where you differ from our opinions. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com or write something up at our guild at boardgamebarrage.com/guild and give us a 5-star if you'd be so kind. And finally, as always, a big thank you to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? Until next week, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
But what Founders of Teotihuacan is...
Anything
your
from
pronunciation there sort of slipped up and down throughout, depending on how fast you said
I actually don't know.
which
What is the correct pronunciation? Teotihuacan? Somewhere in the middle.
It depends on who you ask. I actually went around to some of those places, and Teotihuacan, but there is Teotihuacan. I've heard other board game people say it. So.
Yeah, I've heard both. I don't know where to land. I think I saw. Yeah, it ends up somewhere in the middle.
No, you did. I thought it was admirable.
Yeah.
It was just that it was slipping, sort of like when like a British person is trying to play an American in a movie.
Right.
Or I guess vice versa is probably more common.
anything for the middle to mind?
I think that's probably good.
In a podcast about reviews, we ask for your review.
Oh, that's clever. I'm going to steal that, but then I'll use that for the outro as well.
Yeah, so people know that
proper
both
credit.
of you are just figments of my mind.
That's right.
Different lines here, different lines there, the nice lines, and then the try-hard lines.
No one's ever seen all three of us in the same room together.
I suddenly love the idea of like a podcast that's like multiple people, but then it's all revealed that it's the same person just editing their voice.